at sea, which is often referred to as MEC, which means Maritime Environmental Crimes, also known as the blue crimes. To a certain extent, having listened to the participants, the panelists yesterday, and I do not want to repeat what was said, but suffice it to mention that the issues canvassed yesterday are recurrent, namely, firstly, harmonization of legislation, secondly, institution and interstate cooperation, thirdly, more emphasis on mutual legal assistance, fourth, create a networking platform. Since these have been exhaustively explored, let us delve deeper into uncharted waters, pun intended. The evolutionary nature of maritime environmental crime is not a myth, but a reality. Environmental maritime crime have over the years significantly evolved, and a radical change in the legal landscape is warranted. These crimes are dangerously innovative. The categories have expanded. These are carried out in a very sophisticated manner. The perpetrators are having recourse to the latest technology, and the types of vessel being used are no longer the same. Within the last decade, these have escalated exponentially in variety, volume, and value. Despite considerable attention and action, these remain an increasingly rewarding activity for the perpetrators and a significant challenge for the wide range of actors who aim to defeat it. We, as lawyers, we create the rules, but for the perpetrators, these rules are meant to be broken. In the maritime context, intelligence is received, and if there's a legal basis to intercept, the Coast Guard, or in certain countries, the Navy, will proceed. But the tricky part is that the scenario can unravel and exacerbate and escalate rapidly. Uncertainty, unpredictability further exacerbate the precariousness of the situation. These vessels will be moving. The Coast Guard will try to board. There's little time to collect evidence. Often, most of the time, the perpetrators will be on board of that vessel. Often, intelligence relates to one category of crime, but upon boarding, the Coast Guard discover another category of crime, or other additional crimes, which gives rise to jurisdictional issues. Ladies and gentlemen, the maritime environmental crimes are multidimensional, multi-complex, and multifaceted. The more so, given that it is at the core of the land-sea nexus within the web of transnational organized crime. If the crimes are evolving, the law cannot remain static. The entire criminal chain, from the moment of detection to conviction, must be assessed in light of the evolutionary nature of these crimes. In this domain, legislative proactivity and judicial dynamism are key to successful prosecution. The law cannot be frozen. It cannot be frozen in a time capsule. The protection of environment should not merely be a trend and an aspiration, but it should be a way of life. But that way of life has a darker side. That darker side is the criminal aspect, which cannot be ignored and cannot be dismissed. So, in order to tackle that darker side, we need to think like criminals. So let's give that a try. What are the driving forces? Firstly, from a criminal point of view, high profits. Basically, as far as they are concerned, show me the money. Secondly, low risk of detection. Again, insofar as they are concerned, it's a scenario of catch me if you can. Thirdly, it is linked to corruption, tax evasion, and lawlessness. Again, from their perspective, risky business, but I am willing to take a chance. Concomitantly, the fact that there is no universal definition of maritime environmental crime further compounds the complexity of the issues. The umbrella concept needs to be defined and fine-tuned. Recently, or maybe not that recently, the latest addition onto the environmental maritime crime bandwagon is what is known as Ecocide, which is defined as, and I quote, unlawful or wanton acts committed with knowledge that there is a substantial likelihood of severe and either widespread or damage to the environment being caused by those acts. Thus, there are two types of acts that form the basis of criminal liability. Firstly, you just need to prove the breach of a domestic provision, but it is the second basis which is more controversial, the wanton act. What is meant by wanton act? Wanton act is defined as with reckless disregard for damage, which will be clearly excessive in relation to the social and economic benefits anticipated. Arguably, this is the closest definition that has been coined so far, but the question is the international community ready to embrace that definition with open arms? The nature of transnational organized maritime environmental crimes include illegal dumping, especially of oil, or other ship source pollution activities, such as oil bunkering, which constitute a serious threat to the maritime environment, despite the fact that these activities are subject to strict international legal rules. There is currently no international multilateral treaty imposing international criminal responsibility of natural or legal person for transnational organized crime regarding maritime environmental crime. Clearly a legal lacuna. Ladies and gentlemen, these crimes are transnational in nature, thereby engaging the jurisdictions of various states. So the nature of the transnational environmental crime makes prosecution a complex task, unless consistency among the legal regime is guaranteed. Otherwise, the only way to obtain conviction is to ignore the transnational nature of the crime, divide it into offenses, and to prosecute each separately in a country where it is committed, avoiding all the difficulties that could hinder a conviction. At the heart of these legal proceedings, extradition and mutual legal assistance will be a perennial feature. At the national level, different agencies will be involved, such as the Coast Guard, the Navy, the Central Investigatory Body, Environmental Crime Expert, Custom Office, the Office of the Attorney General, the Office of the Director of Public Prosecution, the Judiciary, and last but certainly not the least, prison. At best, and really at best, maritime environmental crime may be categorized as the following. Firstly, general crimes related to transformations of nature. We focus on extraction and exploitation of nature for profits. Example, disposal issues. Secondly, specific crimes related to the disposal of waste and focuses on the illicit trade in hazardous waste and the role of organized crime groups and multinational cooperation. Thirdly, global crimes relating to worldwide processes which emphasizes the social consequences of climate change and global warming. That's not my mandate, at least not at the GMCP. Fourthly, group refers to specific crimes related to specific geographical regions and deals with issues such as illegal fishing. Let us take illegal fishing, for instance. On one hand, the transnational organized criminal group may be directly involved in fisheries crime by engaging in large-scale, organized, illegal fishing activities on a widespread document fraud, tax fraud, corruption, and money laundering. On the other hand, seemingly compliant fishing operators may engage in parallel criminal activities, usually obscured by multi-level business operations, such as laundering illegally caught fish by mixing them with legally sourced product and selling them through legitimate trading relationship. The United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea delineates the ocean order, including the rights and obligations of the flag state, port states, and coastal state. At least we know that this is basically the type of jurisdiction that we have. The problem right now is all the offenses that in relation to environmental maritime crimes are scattered in different conventions. So for instance, if you have a vessel transporting illicit material or trying to dump in a specific maritime zone, that because of the lack of consistency in the legislation, it will depend where that vessel is intercepted, where it is arrested, and where the prosecution is being conducted. So that same vessel may be found guilty in country A, but not in country B, and maybe not in country C. I can see I have 1 minute left. I have way more to talk, but of course I respect the time, and I'll probably go for a few issues while we do the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Pujai, especially for keeping the time, and you have put a lot of emphasis on the fact that there must be harmonization of legislation across countries, and there are many issues of maritime crimes in the region, especially East Africa, for trafficking in persons, illegal fishing, and also drug trafficking. So I think we have taken good note of that. Can I ask the next speaker, Paul Alexander Muteti, who is the Senior Assistant DPP of Kenya.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Allow me then to speak about the Kenyan perspective in the fight against transnational organized crime in the form of environmental crimes. I make that statement deliberately because the very nature of these crimes being transborder, then all the conventions that deal with the question of transnational organized crime relating to international cooperation come into play, and countries have got to pay attention to them even as we seek to root out economic crimes, environmental crimes. The world generally has identified 4 forms of international environmental crimes. Notably, pollution occupies the very first slot in the categorization of such offenses. Pollution in the sense that if you have countries that border the oceans, for instance, the very risk of disposal of hazardous waste into the waters of adjacent to a state poses a great threat to marine life. Marine life has proven to be a core component of food that most populations of the world, and more so speaking of countries that are mainly islands, depend on for their survival. So that for every civilized nation, eliminating the threat of pollution remains a key factor in controlling environmental crimes. Now, this situation cannot be overemphasized. For instance, looking at the question of oil spills into the oceans, and the Kofu Channel case comes into mind when these 2 ships that were involved in a collision, and there was a lot of massive oil spill which led to fires within the harbor and massive destruction of marine life, then countries quickly realized there was need to settle the law on the question of pollution and the due diligence aspect that states must always live up to. When you load hazardous waste onto any vessel, for instance, it is your duty and obligation to ensure that such waste does not spill over or is not disposed in a manner that compromises the health and safety of marine life. And close to pollution is the threat of climate change. Climate change, for those of you who live within this region of Africa and who bear me a testimony, for example, using Kenya as an example, our rainfall has gone down. That has posed a great threat not only to wild animals, but also domestic animals. And so is food security when you generally look at the question of animal and cross and crop husbandry. So for countries to eliminate the danger of food shortages, then climate change must be addressed. The Earth Summit in the Rio de Janeiro in 1992, the world came to an agreement. There was danger to reduce the threat of hydrofluorocarbons that are emitted from our greenhouses and other operations on land, so that every country that engages in crop husbandry, the chemicals that you use do not emit as gases that deplete the ozone layer. So every country is called upon then to discharge its obligation of ensuring that you have sufficient legislative framework to punish acts that may cause climate change. Now, climate change also is connected to the question of deforestation as a major crime, environmental crime. Logging within our forests has seen the water catchment areas dry up. That has had a very devastating effect not only to the flora and fauna, but also in terms of ensuring that we have a sustainable development as a country. We need to focus more on logging, stopping it, and getting all of those persons who encourage it to ensure that we do not then permit the continued deforestation of our forests. Any licensed activities within these forests also require tree replanting, because again, you cannot have a tree that will last forever. So as they die, as you harvest, then you have a duty to make sure that those forests are replaced. And the fourth category of environmental crime is the loss of biodiversity. Now, there are countries that are notorious destinations for sale of, say, ivory as trophies. Some cultures embrace the use of animal parts, such as ivory, hooves, and such other parts of animals to make ornaments. When I say this, and I speak without hesitation, countries in the Far East, that is Korea, Thailand, and other nations within that region, have been a major destination, and Kenya has really been a victim of that market. In the year 2014, Kenya managed to nab 34 containers of rosewood that are still lying at our port here in Mombasa. This rosewood was harvested down in Madagascar, and these guys were taking it all the way to Thailand, or so it is alleged. Now that confirms you have a ready market for such products. And then the question is, this country, being a member of the Community of Nations and a signatory to the UN treaty, don't they pay attention to Chapter 7 of the UN Convention on Threats to Security and International Peace and Tranquility? Time has come when countries must come out and call out others for what they are and what they stand for. If you sign a treaty, you do and agree with me as lawyers that you have a duty to ensure that the treaty components are fully implemented and respected. And if you do not then give effect to a treaty to which you are a signatory, then your country risks being cited before the UN Security Council. And that may come with very severe consequences that may include trade embargoes and such other restrictions being imposed on your country. Now, quickly moving to actual prosecution of these offenses, we as a country have realized or identified certain threats to prosecution. Bringing a legal finish to these cases is not easy. And I'll single out the court process as I know it here in Kenya. First of all, long delays in conclusion of cases are a fertile ground for encouraging the commission of these crimes. So that as countries, you must be ready to have a functional judicial system that punishes these incidents within what one would call foreseeable periods that you can project within this number of months. We are going to be done with a case, and the effects of the punishment that come with it are going to be felt. The second challenge is a soft law, soft in the sense that the penalty regime is not stringent enough. In Kenya, if you look at the Environmental Management Coordination Act, you will realize that penalties are not that punitive to discourage a large-scale commission of these offenses. For example, if you can get away with 18 months for dumping a whole ship of hazardous waste off the coast of Mombasa, then what is the lesser risk? If you're an international criminal, it may not matter to you because of the economic benefit that you manage to get out of the commission of such crimes. So we also need to strengthen our laws to ensure that we do not become a safe haven. The third challenge that we have identified is a slow embracing of technology in the manner in which we dispense justice. And as I conclude, if you do not employ technology in investigations and prosecutions, then you stand the risk of losing otherwise very strong cases. With that, I thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Paul. In a country like Kenya, where there's such a diversity of fauna and flora, the risks are even greater. And we know in this region about the smuggling of rosewood, ivory, problems with pollution. Interesting speech. Can I ask now Paul, who is the Director of Asset Forfeiture, Transnational and Specialized Crimes Division, the National Prosecution Service of Tanzania. Are the other panelists here? Please start. Thank you.
So in the interest of time, you can skip to the third slide. Next. Yeah, so last but one. Move back a bit. Yeah. So I will zero in the last area which my colleague, Learned Counsel Mteti, touched on, which is the loss of biodiversity. And this is because in Tanzania, this has been our worst nightmare, and actually the biggest challenge. In terms of what Pooja said, in Tanzania, we are also victims of various environmental crimes, the illegal, unreported, and unregulated fishing, the illegal logging, but also pollution, as highlighted by my colleague. But now poaching has been our worst nightmare. And these facts and figures confirm what I've just said. In the span of 5 years, between 2009 and 2014, we lost 60.3% of our elephant population. And in that same period of time, according to the official ETIS data, Elephant Trade Information System, 70% of the illegally trafficked ivory, which has been seized across the globe, came from Tanzania first, and then Kenya coming second. So you can imagine all the seizures in the world, 70% of all the seizures of ivory came from Tanzania and Kenya. And according to the official statistics, 79% of the seized ivory was destined to Asia, Southeast Asia, as my colleague has pointed out. And the main catalyst for the mushrooming of the illegal wildlife trade, as Pooja said, is generation of profits. So I'll just give you an example of how the situation was in 2013. So in 2013, when Tanzania, when poaching was at its highest peak in Tanzania, you could sell 1 kilogram of ivory up to $80 per 1 kilogram. So you can imagine one elephant tusk, a single tusk, has an average weight of between 23 and 45 kilograms. So if you are able to have one elephant tusk, you can do the math, and the very, very same tusk, if it reaches the streets of Shanghai in China, a single kilogram would sell up to 2,000 USD. And therefore, these huge profits, the lucrative nature of the business, moved, and everyone now wanted to kill an elephant because there was market, and the demand was so high. And because of those dynamics in Tanzania, the simple poaching evolved into a complex transnational organized crime. Next. So just like in other countries which experienced highest level of illegal wildlife trade, in Tanzania, poaching took the shape of various levels. So you have the level 1, which now include the expendable foot soldiers, the actual hunters of elephants. But these would not be able to go and poach an elephant if they do not have a gun, if they're not able to carry that tusk all the way to the urban centers. And by the way, one elephant tusk is very heavy. As I said, a single tusk can weigh up to 30 kilograms, and that is the average tusk. But now you'd also have the linkmen, the middlemen, and on the top level of the poaching level, you'd find now the kingpins, the actual financiers, managers, and supervisors of these criminal syndicates. And therefore, in Tanzania, we used to have high level of conviction. We would have, plenty of convictions, but the problem persisted. And we realized that we were dealing with the wrong level. It is only when that we started to, we decided to make key interventions so as to address the real structure of the poaching level in Tanzania. One of the key interventions was to overhaul our Wildlife Conservation Act, and now with the stringent penalties, the minimum sentence for possession of a single ivory is 20 years imprisonment. But secondly, poaching, the wildlife crimes, were also designated as economic crimes, and the reasons are not far to seek. In Tanzania, during this time, 17% of our GDP came from tourism. And our tourism in Tanzania is wildlife-based. And therefore, 90% of our wildlife, of our tourism industry was dependent on wildlife. And therefore, we decided to designate these offenses as economic crimes. But again, in the office of the DPP, there was an establishment of a dedicated section which only dealt with these cases 24/7. Another intervention which was taken by Tanzania was was the multi-agency approach, whereby a dedicated national task force was established which dealt with poaching. This task force comprised of officials from all relevant law enforcement agencies, from the corruption perspective, from the financial perspective. So everyone was put together in the single task force, and our office also seconded one state attorney who only dealt with the asset forfeiture issues and financial investigation. Another intervention was the issuance of Directive Number 1 of 2017, whereby the Director of Public Prosecution under Section 18 of our National Prosecution Service, which mandates him to issue directives, guidelines, and instructions which apply not only to investigators but also prosecutors, issued this directive, and there was now a standardized way of dealing with wildlife cases across the country. And last but not least, as touched by my colleague Pooja, we also reformed our MLA regime, and in 2018, the DPP was designated as a central authority for mutual legal assistance, and DPP was also given the asset forfeiture mandates. Next. So, as a result of these key interventions, we started catching the big fish. There was a case where 3 Chinese nationals were arrested with 706 elephant tusks, and the seizure of these tusks was a result of deployment of intelligence-led investigation and special investigative techniques. Actually, this was one of the very first cases where the special investigative techniques were deployed in terms of intelligence-led surveillance and so forth. And the seizure, this particular seizure, the financial investigation was conducted, which led to a subsequent seizure just a week later. Next, in Zanzibar, whereby 3 tons of ivory were seized at the Zanzibar port. The containers came from Dar es Salaam port to Zanzibar en route to Hong Kong. So you can see these 2 seizures were linked. There was a single seizure, and the financial investigation was conducted, which resulted in a subsequent seizure just a week later. Next. We also have this rhino case on, whereby 4 Chinese nationals who crossed to Tanzania from Malawi were also arrested with 11 rhino horns. And this was also an intelligence-led investigation case, which resulted into the seizure of these 11 rhino horns. And by the way, prosecution of this particular case took only 21 days. From the day when these individuals were taken to court to the final date of judgment, it only took 21 days. And this was one of the case which now really showed that our efforts were really yielding results. Next. And then there was this very interesting case whereby in July 2015, there were Chinese nationals who were arrested at Zurich International Airport. These individuals came from Tanzania. They had 8 suitcases full of ivory. And the interesting with this case is that these individuals were released on the same day by the Swiss authorities. And they were given a very small fine of 3,000 USD. You can imagine, seizure of 8 bags full of ivory. The value of ivory seized was more than 750,000 USD, but they only paid 3,000 USD and they were released. And the news about this seizure only came to public a month later. That is when we came to learn that there's been a seizure of ivory which came from Tanzania. Now, as a result of this of this seizure, we sent MLA requests to the Switzerland. Again, the request was returned after after a couple of months, saying it has to be in English, in German, because it was in English. But again, we sent the German translated version of the request, and finally we were able to prosecute these individuals. We also sent another MLA request to the US, to the CITES designated forensic lab in Oregon. Next. Next. And then I think you're all aware of the Queen of Ivory case, allegedly most notorious trafficker in our region. She was convicted, and her conviction drew headlines from all across the globe. You can see headlines from the New York Times, the Fox, CNN, Al Jazeera, and so forth. So that will be it in the interest of time. Thank you very much, and it was a pleasure to present before you.
Thank you, Alexander. It is a rather disturbing sight to see that elephants are killed unlawfully simply to get their tusk and place it on an illegal market. But the good thing is that you have managed to enforce the law, obtain a few convictions, and retrieve some of the assets that have come from the proceeds of this unlawful crime. Our next speaker is Limuel. He's going to be our main presenter, and so can I ask him to kickstart his presentation? Thank you.
Hamjambo, habari ya hasabohi. I'm a New York environmental lawyer, and I'm so glad to be here sharing with you this morning, but I still am very attached to my old-fashioned legal pad. Greetings from Miss Letitia James, the New York State Attorney General in the U.S. Miss James is the 67th Attorney General of the state of New York. She is an experienced attorney and public servant with a long record of accomplishments. She is the first woman of color to hold statewide office in New York and the first woman to be elected Attorney General by New York voters. And Ms. James is my boss. I lead the Environmental Protection Bureau in her office. I must quickly note that although I'm representing Attorney General James at this important conference this morning, the views I share here today are my own and do not necessarily reflect the views of the Attorney General or her office. In this discussion of environmental crimes, I would like to address two fundamental questions. First, why prosecute them? Why prosecute environmental crimes? And second, what practices help secure success in these prosecutions? And let's define success not just as securing a conviction, incarceration, or a criminal penalty. Let's define success as achieving environmental enforcement that helps remediate or clean up pollution, helps restore public health or the environment, and yes, that also achieves appropriate punishment, specific deterrence from repetition of the conduct by the defendant, and general deterrence of other similar actors. But if you or your office prosecuted an environmental case or are prosecuting them, you may be thinking, but environmental prosecutions present many, many challenges, as we have heard here. The human health or environmental harm mostly is not obvious and may not be felt immediately. The law may or may not be well developed, and your judge or judges most likely need to be educated on both the environmental harm and the applicable law. And environmental cases are technical and mostly require expert witness testimony. And sometimes the remedies available to address the harm to human health or the environment may be restricted or limited. So with all of those and other challenges, why prosecute environmental crimes instead of all the other types of crime you or your office could prosecute? I submit environmental crimes contribute to illness and death in our populations. They rob our people of their natural heritage. Indeed, they even threaten Mother Earth, who sustains us all with the air to breathe, water to drink, food to eat, and a livable climate. And environmental criminals threaten all of these fundamentals for our lives here on Earth. And they too have internationally organized, run international networks, and ruthlessly exploit economic vulnerability and for their own economic ends. Here in Africa and around the world, we are seeing illicit transboundary movement, trade in and dumping of hazardous waste and other toxic chemicals, illegal logging and trade in tropical woods and other timber, the illegal discharge of pollutants by ships and multinational operations, and the taking and trafficking of wildlife and wildlife products, as we have just heard from Tanzania. But fortunately, governments, international organizations, and NGOs are all working to provide us with legal tools and resources to prosecute environmental criminals. To address our second question, I offer 3 practices for environmental enforcement success drawn from my more than 30 years of practice in this area and from a specific initiative that was criminal asset forfeiture and civil enforcement fused together that my office implemented against an organized criminal enterprise, quite like the ones that are depicted in the American TV show The Sopranos, that dismantled wrecked cars to export the parts of those cars to the global south from Brooklyn and Queens, New York. And in conducting that dismantling business, the criminals drained and pumped petroleum, antifreeze, and other auto fluids into nearby waterways, vented ozone-depleting chemicals into the atmosphere, and mishandled mercury-containing components. So practice number 1 that I would share is focus on the harm of the conduct. In our dismantler cases, the harm primarily was from the discharge of auto fluids into the near-shore marine environment. But the harm also included the release of the ozone-depleting refrigerants into the air and the mishandling of mercury components that exposed workers and their families at home to mercury, a powerful neurotoxin. Practice number 2, focus on available remedies before charging, and if needed for enforcement success, bring in and coordinate with asset forfeiture attorneys and civil enforcement authorities like an attorney general's office or other department with civil enforcement authority to obtain temporary injunctive relief, to immediately stop the illegal conduct by a business enterprise, compel site remediation or cleanup, or provide other civil remedy in addition to the criminal sanction. In the auto dismantler cases, our criminal prosecutors secured indictments, our asset forfeiture attorney obtained seizure orders for equipment, cash, and bank accounts, and our civil lawyers obtained preliminary injunctions against further violations of our environmental laws. When the cases were concluded, individuals and companies were convicted of crimes, the contaminated sites were cleaned up, and new operators resumed dismantling operations in a lawfully compliant manner. And lastly, I offer practice 3. Communicate and coordinate with allied law enforcement authorities. Our auto dismantler cases were first brought to us by a New York City police detective who was on an organized crime task force investigating auto theft. In his surveillance of these dismantling operations, he was troubled by their abhorrent environmental practices and wanted to do something to stop it. The organized crime task force wasn't interested in prosecuting, but we were, and successfully worked those cases. In closing, environmental enforcement requires commitment, creativity, and cooperation through various departments and levels of government, but we all can make a meaningful contribution for a better environment and a healthier planet for all of us. Asante Sana.
Thank you, Emmanuel. You've given us an insight of the maze, actually, to seek all ancillary orders from the court in order to ensure proper enforcement of the environment. We have plenty of time for questions. Javier Montana is not here. So Javier is a colleague of Pooja, and she will put some of the essence of what he was about to tell us. So since we have time, you are welcome to do that.
Thank you. I believe he's on his way. I hope he's on his way. Okay, let's start this. Javier is actually part of another program, wildlife trafficking. While I will not be talking about the elements of the offenses regarding wildlife trafficking or other type of offenses, what I could say is there are different elements which are very common to both maritime crime and wildlife trafficking on which he was supposed to talk about. So firstly, I'll take from what the gentleman said, is why do we prosecute? We need to prosecute because, firstly, it's a billion-dollar industries. We are talking about trafficking of waste. We are talking about wildlife trafficking. We are talking about illegal poaching. We are talking about dumping of hazardous waste in the high seas. So both in terms of crimes happening on land or crimes happening at sea, there is an urgent need to prosecute. Secondly, I am glad to hear, for example, Kenya and Tanzania, where there have been prosecutions, so there are many efforts at the level of different agencies to kind of work together, coordinate together. But obviously at the United Nations, we are trying to push for some sort of common definition of that crime. We've got a few suggestions. For example, based on meetings that I've had with prosecutors in the region, a lot of them suggested that why not consider environmental crime as a serious crime under Article 2 of the Transnational Organized Crime. Therefore, this is going to be the definition of serious crime, and then come up with different elements of the offenses. Secondly, another suggestion was in relation to the European Union directive, or rather convention, regarding incorporation of criminal law into environmental crimes. And I think this is the better option, because what the European Union has done is promoting the doctrine of ubiquity, which means essentially it doesn't matter where the crime is being committed, because we are talking about transnational organized crime. We're talking about environmental crime, which is happening in one territory and maybe have effects on different territories. So the doctrine of ubiquity essentially means, regardless of where the crime is committed, you can still prosecute the moment that one element of that crime is has been committed on your territory. Another point which I think is extremely important is, regardless of how robust your legislation is, regardless of how stringent the penalties will be, what is important is enhancing the level of detection, enhancing the level of enforcement, be it on land or be it at sea. If you cannot detect, if you cannot figure out where the crimes are being committed, how do you bring about the prosecution? How do you ensure that these crimes are amenable under those robust legislation? So detection is key. How do you detect? Now it's up to figure out whether you've got special agencies who are adequately well-versed in the technicalities, in the legal technicalities or the operational technicalities that arise with environmental maritime crimes, be it on land and at sea. So for instance, when we talk about, let's say, detections at sea, we need extremely sharp and acute maritime domain awareness. We need satellite imagery. We need to be able to see it. We need to be able to predict it. We need to be able to figure out where that crime is going to happen next. So if at the detection level, there is weak law enforcement, again, it doesn't matter how severe the penalties are, because at the end of the day, these crimes will not come within within the ambit of the legal legislation. So the other thing is corruption. We can detect, but if these crimes are happening, it's because there's a high level of corruption, which is extremely intrusive at the level of different offices in various countries. So unless you can combat corruptions, you can enhance detection again, it will not come under the remit of the legislation. So detection, fighting corruption, getting more equipment, trying to come up with a new definition, a sort of an umbrella whereby all types of different environmental crimes can fit in. That will make it easier. We've spoken about harmonization of legislation many times. I don't want to linger more on it, but suffice it to say is that if in one country you can be convicted but for a crime, and you go to another country you can't be convicted for that crime, we are not achieving that legal finish. We are not winning that fight against maritime crime as a transnational organized crime. And that is applicable, again, whether it's on land or at sea. So what the United Nations is pushing for is trying to see if states are now ready and willing to endorse a definition of the environmental crime, which again is not defined. Like I said earlier, it's scattered in different conventions, and also to be able to first to be able to evaluate the trend, to be able to predict the new trend, to be able to assess intelligence. I'll give you one example. I don't have the answer to that. I hope you have the answer. I go back to the vessel. If a crime is being committed in one territory, like I said earlier, there is no guarantee that that perpetrator can be arrested or convicted on different territories. But now we have something called an autonomous vessel. There are 4 degrees of autonomous vessel, and I will talk about the degree 3 and degree 4. These autonomous vessels are being controlled remotely. There is no one on that autonomous vessel. That vessel is on the sea, it's going, somebody else from another country has access, can tell you exactly where it's going and what it's going to do. You don't know. So technically, there is no one on that vessel. That vessel has a brain of its own. Now, we are talking about transnational organized crime. But that same crime, with that autonomous vessel having nobody on board, that vessel can create significant damage. It can create maritime terrorism. And again, we don't have the definition of maritime terrorism at sea. But that autonomous vessel can create significant damage on the sea, and we don't know. We don't have a law regulating that. So environmental crime, be it on land or at sea, there are many gaps in the definition, but again, the law is evolving at a very slow pace, but the criminals are not one step, not 2 steps, not even 1,000 miles, or if we want to say 1,000 nautical miles ahead of us. At this point where we are still trying to figure out how do we tackle illicit trafficking of plastic or dumping at sea or other types of crimes, environmental crimes that we have just mentioned. They are coming up with new ways, and we don't have solutions to those new ways. So it is up to us, the UN, to work together with you, the states, to see if we are able to find practical solutions to crimes, environmental crimes. But these crimes, again, we have no idea where they can manifest, when they can manifest, and in what form they can manifest. Thank you.
Thank you, Pooja. Maybe I would invite one of my friends from the small island, because both Mauritius and the Seychelles, we suffer from the vulnerability of our territorial sea and waters, and illegal dumping, fisheries, illegal fisheries. Very recently, we had Mauritius suffered from an oil spill from a big tanker that was coming close to the shore, because the captain wanted to get the internet connection. So. It has caused tremendous damage to our coastline. Luckily, we have been able to salvage most of the consequences of that oil spill. Seychelles has a very robust policy of conservation, because some of its small islands are very precious with unique fauna and flora. And this is the asset of this island. But nevertheless, I'm going to tempt my good friend, Frank Ali, the Attorney General of Seychelles, to share some of the experience with us.
Thank you, Mr. Bulel. In fact, as you just said, we have, Seychelles is has very small landmass, and it is considered a small island state, but it is, I always say that it is a very big country, big in terms of its sea area, the exclusive economic zone that it exploits. And we have one island called El Dabra, which is the second largest atoll in the world, with very special flora and fauna that is always threatened because there's a lot of tankers that sail right next to it on its way to other destinations. And in fact, I've been in some discussions with the UNODC into how, for example, we don't end up like Pooja has just said, with those autonomous vessels, so that if ever they enter the EEZ, then they would give us notice of that. Or if they do not give us notice of it, then they will have their equipment, their AIS on, so that at least we'll be able to pick up their presence in the country. And this is because there is a lot of foreign vessels that illegally fish in our waters, and they have become very intelligent so as to fish on the border of the EEZ, and so we will enter into the EEZ and then go out of the EEZ. And with lack of resources, it's very difficult for us to be able to police and enforce the robust legislation that we have. For example, we have a very good Fisheries Act with quite stiff sentences to deter those who exploit our waters illegally. And this is very common, as I said, and often from neighboring states like Sri Lanka, India. In fact, only a couple of weeks ago, we had quite a number of vessels with a crew of about 70 who were caught by the Coast Guard. So what we also have, we have empowered the Coast Guard and also the Air Force to carry out surveillance. And in fact, as I speak, there is a bill before the National Assembly, because the Coast Guard is part of the Defense Forces and not part of the police, for us to empower the Coast Guard constitutionally, the Defense Forces in particular, constitutionally, to be able to enforce our international obligations, especially in the economic, exclusive economic zone. So we do have put a lot of emphasis on environmental protection. Domestically, we have the Environment Protection Act, but the problem is more or less domestic. But we do our best to enforce this legislation. We just, in fact, last year, enacted the Trade in Wild Fauna and Flora, which more or less codified quite a number of provisions to be in tune with the CITES Convention. So and now the regulations are being put in place so as we prevent the illegal exportation of some of our species. Thank you.
Thank you, Frank. That was impromptu and it's a very good aperçu that we got from you. Now, we have, as I said, some time available. Can anyone share a bit of from his own country's perspective about deforestation, smuggling of rosewood, and climate change? I'll give you time to think about it. In the meantime, I'm going to ask my friend, the prosecutor of South Africa, Zinyati, to ask a question to the panel.
Just a question to the panel for your views. In the area of poaching, In South Africa, you've got these rich game farmers who breed rhinos. And they, for the safety of their own rhinos, they cut their horn. They dehorn their rhino and have got large stations of rhino horn in their farms, waiting for that day when rhino horn trade would be deregulated. Now, there is a school of thought that says the reason why the market and the industry is flourishing is because it is outlawed. If you make it regulated and control it, the market would be neutralized because everything would be regulated. Now, these game farmers that I'm talking about are in the forefront of this lobby to regulate rhino horn and decriminalize it. What are your views on this?
So, thank you, my colleague from South Africa. I think we are all aware of the divergent views on the issue, and for those who have ever attended the CITES Conference of Parties meetings, there are two divergent opinions. So there are proponents of those who say if you make it legal and you regulate the market, probably the poaching will go down. But there are others, the opponents of that motion, who say if we legalize, let's say, sale of these products, the poaching will be fueled because now people will have even more reason to go and find that rhino horn or elephant tusk because there is a readily available market. And for that reason, we're all aware of those occasions whereby the southern states, Botswana, Zimbabwe, and other southern countries, were allowed to have a single sale of their stockpiles. And there are studies which show that that window, which was opened to these southern African southern states, fueled poaching because, shortly before the window, poaching was very low, but after the window, where these countries were allowed to sell their stockpiles of ivory, somehow poaching came up. So there is that point of departure, as I said, for those who say we should never have a legal market, but others are also saying the other way around. And I can mention in Tanzania, we have the largest stockpiles of ivory. And studying these trends, as a country, we are looking at other plans of utilizing the resources, maybe of opening a museum and so forth. Because for those who do not know, we no longer have tuskers. The tuskers are gone. So if you go to our ivory room, you can find an ivory which is very long. I mean, it can come right from the bottom all the way almost to the roof of this ceiling. Very huge elephant tusk, which was kept from 1980s, 1990s. And I don't know how the Conference of Parties of CITES will deliberate and resolve on this issue, but as of now, there is that predicament.
Thank you. Well, it's the United Nations, so we are not going to say we do not need to regulate. We need to regulate. But it's true, this is an issue that we are facing. Ironically, the stronger the regulations, the stronger the law, it's not having that deterrent impact. In fact, the more we are regulating, the more the crimes are being committed. So based on statistics, based on lots of evidence that came to us, it is clear that stronger regulation is helping prosecution, but at no point is it actually preventing the market itself from flourishing. And that's a very tricky balance that we are trying to strike. We are having discussions with many prosecutors in the region, be it on this side, I mean, the African continent or elsewhere, and it's the same issue repetitively. So, in essence, what can we do? The question, like I say, of not regulating does not arise. The question of should we have laws which are less stringent, that's not the answer as well. Can we actually prosecute these crimes while ensuring that it has a deterrent impact? So far, it's not looking that successful. So we have a few roadmap in the pipeline right now, and hopefully we are going to present that to member states, at least the one we are working with, and see if the states are going to endorse these type of recommendations that we are going to put forward. But it's a fine line between strong legislation and ensuring that these strong legislations have a deterrent impact.
Yes, thank you. Actually, you raise a very important question, which I would almost classify as the chicken and egg argument. When you look at the question of sustainable development goals as agreed by the international community, the question of intergenerational equities is so important, so that the community of today benefits from the natural resources that are available without compromising the interests of the future generations that come. But the danger that we have in lifting these trade embargoes on ivory or rhino horns is this, that the poachers of the world will identify those countries that can be used as routes, just like with the drugs and other contrabands. And the channeling of illegally obtained ivory tusks, and you're talking about rhino horns, would be going through those countries and then end up in the legitimate market. Now, the solution and middle ground would be this, in my view. If we create a DNA data bank for each country, so that we are able to say, rhino A from this country, this is the genetic strand that you expect from it. That would help in enforcement, so that if you come across rhino horns in a neighboring country, you could quickly subject it to forensic analysis and retrace the origin of that ivory or rhino horns. Without that, we run the risk of what happened to the white rhino. It is now almost extinct, courtesy of lifting these trade bans. So the world has to look at adopting technology, and creating these data banks seems to be the most attractive idea at the moment. Otherwise, we cannot open the doors for everybody who feels like selling ivory or rhino horns to go into it. We will very quickly deplete all the resources that we have, compromising our tourism sector, and that has a lot of effects on it.
So thank you for that question. From the perspective, if you will, of a market country, the United States, and New York specifically, I want to not offer an easy solution or answer, but point out that one of the legal factors in legalization of a trade in ivory or other extractive wildlife products is that a number of receiving countries have absolute bans. We have an absolute ban on the sale of ivory, subject to very, very rigorous exceptions in the state of New York. And we also have a ban on the sale of rhino horn or other kinds of extractive products, including uncertified tropical wood. So I think that coordination, whatever the answer is, if it's not an absolute ban, to regulate the transactions, the sale internationally of these products would require some thought and adjustments in some ways in the receiving country's laws. So I just want to put that on the table as one factor. The broader question, I think there's no one answer to. It's a process. In the United States right now, in my state, we are dealing with that question as it regards to the legalization or criminality of cannabis. Our laws across the country are a patchwork quilt. Some say yes, some say no. Synchronizing, harmonizing that law, I think, is a very big challenge, but worthy of further consideration and potential change. Thank you.
We have time for one last question. Anyone wants to ask a question? Yes, the representative from Egypt. You will have to need your, there will be translation. Please put your headphones.
أعتقد أن تكدس المخازن بالعاج المستولى عليه بطريقة غير شرعية، وزي ما زميلنا في تنزانيا بيقول إنها كميات كبيرة جدا ومن التسعينات دون الاستفادة بيها، أرى أنه يمكن أن تنشأ متاحف
because they don't have headphones. Can you translate that? Okay, so please go ahead, and our friend there, Mohammed, is going to translate for us.
أعيد أن بقاء العاج في المخازن زي ما زميلنا في تنزانيا بيتكلم إن هناك كمية كبيرة ومن التسعينات مملوء بها المخازن، إن ده إهدار ويتعين الاستفادة بتلك الأشياء. أرى أنه يمكن أن تنشأ متاحف في الدول أو العديد من الدول، ويتبنى هذه المبادرة الأمم المتحدة، ويخصص دخل زيارات هذه المتاحف إلى حماية الحيوانات. لكن إني أفضل مستمر في تخزينها دون الاستفادة على وجه الإطلاق منها، أرى أنه إهدار. شكرا.
Okay, we'll have a translation by Mohammed for the panel.
So Councillor Saad is mentioning that our colleague in Tanzania mentioned that in the stores we have a lot of ivory that goes back to the 90s. And he thinks it would be a better idea to put it in museums and get the money out of whoever visit the museum and use it to protect the wildlife. Otherwise it would be a waste.
So, as I said, that has been the idea that has been floated, bearing or cognizant of the fact that there are no hopes that there will be another window for one sale of ivory, the window which was given to Zimbabwe, Namibia, Botswana, whereby 50 tons of ivory from the stockpiles of these 4 countries were able to be auctioned in Japan, generating lots of money. So in Tanzania, we have our own perspective on the subject, and as suggested by the Deputy Prosecutor General from Egypt, we are looking at other ways of generating funds from the use of the ivory, including establishing the biggest or the largest ivory museum in the world, because as I said, we believe we have the largest ivory in the world. In Kenya, in Tanzania, there used to be tuskers, those huge elephants with very long tusks, even touching the ground. But those tuskers are now extinct, and in Tanzania, we still have those big tusks, and opening a museum is one of the suggestions that is currently being floated, and I hope that idea will materialize, and we should be able now to generate, because you see these ivory, not all of them come from poaching. You see, in Tanzania and other legislations, once an elephant dies, you have to keep the ivory. We call it a trophy. So not all ivory that we are keeping came from poaching. Plenty of them came from the natural death of elephants. So we are keeping them, and we hope to utilize them in a way that will generate revenues, and the same revenues will be channeled back to other conservation activities. Thank you.
Thank you. Our last panelist has just arrived in the nick of time, and so we will give him 5 minutes for his last intervention. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. I was just making my way from Nairobi on the first flight and managed to get here 5 minutes to the time, so I'll just keep it to 5 minutes. I just wanted to bring a little bit of the perspective of what we're doing as the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime through three programs actually, supporting the facilitation of information exchange and cross-border collaboration to counter illicit trafficking. And I want to briefly mention the work that is being done by the Container Control Program, the Airports Communication Program, and the Program for Combating Crimes that Affect the Environment from the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime. So we are supporting countries in the region, and in Africa in particular, to enhance the understanding of the current situation of the capabilities and the work that is being done in terms of the criminal justice responses to crimes that affect the environment, including wildlife and forest crime. We started our work in the region focusing primarily on wildlife crime. We have expanded that work now to include work on forest-related crime, and now on fisheries and fisheries crime and crimes in marine protected areas. We are also supporting the enhancing the detection of illicit trafficking through supporting interagency cooperations in country level by supporting the establishment and consolidation of interagency units that work on targeting illicit cargo based on risk profiles using commercial documentation, as well as information and intelligence that can be gathered and operationalized from within the national structure. Through the program on crimes that affect the environment, we provide a support from the scenes of crime to the court with a strong focus on prosecution and investigation capacity building. We have developed several tools for the countries that are present here, including Kenya, Tanzania, Uganda, Namibia, Botswana, Zimbabwe, and various others. That are tools that bring together in a one-stop shop for both prosecutors and investigators these points to prove to the relevant offenses in wildlife, forest, and fisheries crime in order to support the investigator at the time of building the case file, and then also the prosecutors, and support the work and the relation between prosecutors and investigators in order to enhance the improvement of the cases being presented in court. And that has already proven and shown great results where we know that in Kenya, for example, and in Tanzania, and Mr. Kadushi can attest to that, we have had increases in terms of the conviction rate because of cases being better prepared, passing from 30% to over 70% now. Very important, we also work on sensitization to the judiciary, which is another key actor, because it doesn't matter if all our processes are well done from the scene of crime management, the evidence, etc. And if the sentences that are provided by the judiciary are not consistent and not deterrent to counter the transnational organized crime. Another area of work that we are clearly supporting is addressing the so-called elephant in the room, right? Preventing corruption within wildlife authorities, where we are supporting the wildlife authorities to do a risk-based analysis of key risk areas that can be susceptible to corruption, then develop risk mitigating strategies, and then to implement the activities in order to reduce those risks from coming together. And lastly, one of the key aspects and why this meeting is so important is enhancing and strengthening interregional cooperation. We are very keen on supporting this to work and the work of networks such as the EAAP. We also have the wildlife interregional enforcement meetings, which the first one was convened here in Kenya in 2018, where we bring countries from Africa and Southeast Asia, from the prosecution side, investigation side, and financial investigation side, as well as customs, in order to be able to discuss and exchange information on actual cases, as well as to build a network to enhance this interregional cooperation. I would like to also bring across already some of the results that we have seen. So it's not only necessarily the support that we do in terms of the disruption or the interdictions that we do in terms of the number of seizures, but it's also very important that we build the cooperation so that they can be adequately prosecuted. And also to try to see how can we move upwards, not only from prosecuting the low-level criminals, being the poachers or the low-level traffickants in other type of illicit commodities, which they will have several individuals that are ready to take the position of those persons that have been arrested, but also to dig a little further to be able to support the disruption of the criminal syndicate. And that is done only through international cooperation, as well as to the approach of following the money, going into financial investigations, and be able to work across the countries and across the regions. And I would like to bring some of the outcomes of the previous East Africa Association of Prosecutors conference in Arusha, where there was the idea already, and one of the outcomes and the propositions was to advance the network through both supporting physical and virtual meetings. And we're very pleased to see that we're not only in this marvelous and well-attended meeting of in-person, as well as with regional platforms. There was also the suggestion to support the digital transmission of MLA requests, which could be a way to advance further and facilitate bureaucratic processes. And one key element was a pool of legal translators, which we all know it's very difficult to obtain. So that's one of the points where we could be looking forward to. And also to be able to see how can we support sort of a regional body that might be able to support the investigations across in a form of some way of Europol or any kind of mechanism that will fit the region. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Javier. Now, I think we will close the session now. It's been a very interesting session. I hope we leave this hall wiser by realizing the challenges of blue crimes, green crimes, and how the difficulties we encounter to enforce the law. So I invite you to give a round of applause to all the panelists this morning. Thank you. There's a break, tea break now. Can anyone help me? Do we have a break now? No?